Today I am reading from the book From Bondage to Bonding, Escaping Codependency, Embracing Biblical Love by Nancy Groom. I'll be reading chapter 6 today, titled Self-Deception, Committed to Denial. Denial is the common currency of troubled families. Jail Greenleaf, co-alcoholic, para-alcoholic, who's who in codependency. Robert is an older man with a gentle spirit and a charming wife, Janet. They never had children. Robert is the eldest of 4 children born of a strict religious man and a passive, sickly woman. Throughout his life, he'd been unable to please his stern, demanding father, who would periodically binge on uncontrollable rages, with Robert taking the brunt of it. Even as an adult, he would receive monthly phone calls from his father and listen to hour-long diatribes against his character, job performance, and personal ability. Robert couldn't bring himself to just hang up. It was his only link to his father. But because of the verbal abuse, Robert believed that the important people in his life could never think well of him. To offset the pain of being unable to win his father's approval, Robert became too nice, selling his integrity for the sake of other people's affirmation. Unconsciously, he was driven to prove his father wrong and win his father's love after all the years of neglect and abuse. Robert took the blame for whatever went wrong on his job, even when it clearly was someone else's fault, because he wanted his co-workers to like him. He was always the first to apologize, especially with Janet. His motto was peace at any cost. Robert was not a risker. Careful never to put himself in a position where he might look bad, this man missed out on much good he could have done if he had dared try. He narrowed his boundaries to include only what he could do well, closing his eyes to his giftedness and closing the door on opportunities to develop those gifts. He wouldn't involve himself in any of his church's programs because he refused to see himself as competent or significant to people. Robert's words about himself were consistently negative, even in those circumstances when he had genuinely succeeded. He looked humble and self-sacrificing, but in fact, Robert was deeply angry about being devalued. He turned his unacknowledged anger inward, believing himself worthless and becoming ruthlessly self-contemptuous. His humble spirit didn't flow from a position of godly strength, but from a failure to face either his pain or his sin. Robert was a man unaware of how he'd been damaged and unwilling to face his underlying quiet rebellion against God. Codependency maintained by denial. Denial in dysfunctional families refers to the failure or refusal to face honestly what is in any given situation or relationship, a refusal to admit the truth or reality. My pastor, Steve Brown, would challenge me when I came for counseling. Nancy, tell me what is, not what you wish were true or how you think things should be. Denial means we aren't willing to admit what's going on or how bad things really are, or how bad we really are. Denial is learned behavior, especially in troubled families. It happens in 2 ways and accomplishes 2 purposes. Conspiracy of silence. Claudia Black, in her book, It Will Never Happen to Me, examined the 3 unspoken rules of a dysfunctional family. Don't talk, don't trust, don't feel. They are rules about silence, about masking honest appraisals and true feelings regarding what is happening in the family. The conspiracy is not only to remain silent to others, but to not even tell oneself the truth. When parents in an addictive or abusive family conspire to avoid reality, their children conspire with them. They're all ashamed of the drunkenness, eating binges, battering, or pornography, but no one dares mention it, let alone challenge it. Eventually, the shame transfers from "this is what's happening" to "this is who my family is," or "this is who I am," and the reasons for denial intensify. Fear that someone will discover the truth and expose the shame dominates the mood of the home. Denial becomes entrenched, and the children, like their parents, refuse to look at, talk about, or deal with the family's secrets. The don't talk rule does great damage, especially to the children. Family loyalty becomes synonymous with never discussing the family's problems, even as siblings within the home. I was in my 40s before I talked with my brother and sisters about my father's alcoholism and my mother's codependency, and even then we felt disloyal. We had tacitly agreed to keep silence those many years, short-circuiting the understanding and grace we might have offered one another had we felt free to address reality. Denial does much to sustain an addictive or abusive family system. It also perpetuates the system because an unexamined pattern of abuse repeats itself, making the abuse multi-generational. The rules of silence remain in place until someone dares to challenge the system and open the door to change. Denial of the problem. The first level of denial is an unwillingness to admit there even is a problem in the family. Jenny and Brad both denied his drinking was disruptive. Andrea was aware of her codependency, and Joe and Lois were loath to admit Alan's drug problem. Suzanne worked hard to obliterate the memory of her childhood abuse. Robert refused to believe his father had damaged him. The drinking, incest, workaholism, drug dependency, mental illness, or codependency may be obvious to everyone else, but the family members simply refuse to admit anything is abnormal. To them, the dysfunctional home is normal, even if miserable. Things that don't seem normal to the child at first, like daddy lying drunk in the front yard or mommy slumped in a chair dissolved in tears, are explained away as normal. Daddy is camping, or mommy's stomach hurts. Eventually, the child doesn't trust his or her own perceptions anymore, and denial about how crazy things are becomes second nature. But codependents don't just deny the reality of addiction or abuse. They also ignore the problems that come from dysfunction. The codependent compulsively engages in magical thinking, the unfounded expectation that the addiction-related difficulties will somehow improve by themselves. The alcoholic will quit drinking, the pornographer will throw away his books and tapes, the daughter will stop binging or start eating, the parent will begin spending less time at work and more time at home, the addicted wife will find a job and quit using, the husband will stop beating his wife and kids. Somehow, the bills will be paid, the runaway will come home, the yard will get mowed, the spouse will become faithful, the children will no longer have problems at school, the broken bones will stop hurting. To maintain the illusion of normalcy, the codependent often must deny not only the primary problem of addiction or abuse, but also the secondary problems, both practical and relational, that flow out of the addiction or abuse. Denial of emotions. There is a second level of denial that exists beneath the codependent's denial about family problems, both primary and secondary. In discussing this level of denial, J.L. Greenleaf stated, concomitant with denial of the problem is denial of the feelings that the problems produce. This more basic level of denial involves repression, the refusal to allow oneself to feel the negative feelings associated with what's happening in the family. Jenny and her daughters didn't let themselves feel angry about Brad's behavior, nor did Suzanne or Robert open themselves to the pain of their father's abusiveness. Andrea couldn't believe she resented being used by her friends, and Lois refused to face her rage at both Joe and Alan. The masks of frozen feelings these codependents hid behind served to keep them safe from reality and the frightening consequences of becoming honest. Codependents don't merely believe the negative emotions will go away if ignored. They also fear the emotions will get out of hand if released. Their rage, which may not yet be felt consciously, against God and against those who have abused or betrayed them, might break out into open revenge and destroy many. Their loved ones would surely abandon or abuse them if they made known their true feelings. They fear that even God might leave. In the face of incontrovertible evidence, codependents are able to deny how bad things are and how angry and frightened they feel. Their children and colleagues often cooperate in the charade. It's safer to pretend, to minimize the extent or consequences of the problem. 10 years of denial passed from the time I sat on that rock in the Florida Keys knowing Bill had a drinking problem until I attended my first support group meeting for families of substance abusers. And it took an additional 3 years of support group work before I could say without flinching that Bill is an alcoholic. He didn't believe he was, and I wanted to believe him. The deception of denial is incredibly strong. Usefulness of denial. Denial serves many purposes, but there are two general categories of usefulness. Pretense about what is projects a favorable image, especially in the church, and protects us from the pain of disappointing circumstances in relationships. Let's examine these two functions of denial. Impression management. One of the most powerful motivators in today's society is the desire to look good. No one likes to fail, but codependents can't live with themselves unless they're universally admired. Impression management holds top priority for codependents who try to manage their world, their circumstances, and their emotions so as to convince others that their homes are happy and their relationships are functioning well. They are less concerned with how they really feel than with how they ought to feel or how others want them to feel. Andrea, for example, wants to impress others as a woman who can handle any stress or pain. So she must pretend she is never too tired, never too confused, never too selfish to drop whatever she's doing to meet someone else's needs. If she were to look at her true feelings, her anger at being used, her sadness at being ignored, her resentment against her supervisor, the impression she wants to make would suffer and she would feel ashamed and inadequate. So she maintains the ego facade and manages to sustain, for a while, the image of the selfless worker. Denial also keeps us from seeing our own love failures. When Andrea faces her true emotions, she will have to acknowledge that her real goal has been her own self-protection, not ministry to others. She has wanted to look good more than she has wanted to offer her true self to others for their good. Impression management is not just deceitful, it's also unloving. The cost of impression management is high. The relentless fear that the facade might fail and reveal the real person inside inevitably takes its toll. Codependents support their addictive habit with physical payments for their stuffed emotions: ulcers, colitis, migraines, and arthritis, to name a few. Emotionally, they pay, too. Loneliness, bitterness, and failure to genuinely enjoy relationships are just some of the negative consequences of impression management. Relationally, codependents find that shallow friendships are all that's available when they're committed to emotional disguising. But the codependent in denial does get to avoid looking at the mess inside, which brings us to the second major function of denial: protection from the pain of looking within. Protection from pain. When codependents polish the exterior while refusing to examine the interior of their lives, they can put off for a time the painful reality of what is inside, the character flaws, the disappointment about past or present relationships, the failures to love, the lost opportunities, the shattered dreams, the deep loneliness. Denial functions well to keep codependents from facing the inner pain. Timon Cermak said it this way: denial stems from an internal preoccupation with avoiding pain. It is like a flashlight that works in reverse, casting shadows rather than light. It throws darkness over selected parts of the world to make them less noticeable, enabling us to hide embarrassing parts of our personality from our own vision, even though these parts may be obvious to everyone else. Denial prevents us from seeing things that make us too uncomfortable. If codependents are to face life as it really is and make the inner changes that will genuinely transform their lives, they will have to drop the protection denial affords them from the pain of an inside look. King in denial. One of the saddest biblical examples of a man committed to denial is King David. Though he was truly a man after God's own heart, David, in his later years, failed profoundly to face and deal with the weaknesses of his children. The unhappy story is recorded in 2 Samuel 13 through 19. It began when David's eldest son and heir, Amnon, raped his beautiful half-sister Tamar. Disgraced and now unmarriageable, Tamar moved into her brother Absalom's home. Though her father, David, was furious, he denied the atrocity by neither rebuking nor punishing Amnon for his blatant immorality against Tamar. But Absalom did not forget. He brooded for 2 years, planning and then executing the death of Amnon in revenge for his sister's violation. Absalom had to run for his life and remained in exile for 3 years, hearing nothing from his father David. Again, David chose denial and inaction instead of dealing forthrightly with Absalom's murder of Amnon. It was as though Absalom's physical absence from Jerusalem allowed David to close his eyes to the pain of having lost both sons. David simply would not look at or deal with the chaos in his family life. After David finally allowed Absalom to return to Jerusalem, 2 years passed before he allowed his son to enter his presence, and even then he did not deal with Absalom's sin. Absalom had returned unrepentant, bitter about David's failure to deal with Amnon and about his own 5-year banishment from his father's presence. Once more, David had failed to deal with the what is in his family. In the end, David reaped terrible consequences from his denial about his son's sins and his unwillingness to face his responsibility as both father and king to deal justly with them. Absalom later attempted a political coup, instigated a civil war in Israel, slept publicly with his father's concubines, and eventually met a violent death. These circumstances had been foretold by the prophet Nathan as judgment against David for his earlier sin with Bathsheba, 2 Samuel 12:10-12. A footnote in the NIV Study Bible suggests a connection between David's refusal to confront Absalom with his sin and the later tragedy that befell the entire nation. David sidesteps repentance and justice, and in this way he probably contributes to the fulfillment of the prophecy of Nathan. The king's refusal to look at his problem or his pain proved disastrous for his family and for the whole nation of Israel. Negative consequences of denial. Denial is not simply a benign option for dealing with life's problems. As seen in David's life, the consequences of denial are far-reaching and devastating. Denial destroys a person's relationships, resulting in spiritual sterility in relationship to God, loss of authenticity in relationship to oneself, and absence of intimacy in relationships with others. Spiritual sterility. Children who learn to cope with life through denial instead of acknowledging their sin and leaning on God as they work through the pain in their lives often grow up to become adults unconnected to the God they were created to enjoy. Their spiritual impoverishment exhibits itself in many ways, but its primary evidence is their superficial walk with God. I grew up in a decidedly religious environment, but my relationship with God was cerebral and distant. I hid my true self, both my pain and my anger, from Him as I had hidden it from everyone, including myself. Denial kept me safe from God by keeping me from a desperate dependence on His grace that would surely have deepened communion between us. I suspect my experience is common to most codependents. Loss of authenticity. A second consequence of denial is the codependent's loss of authenticity in relationship to themselves. Refusing to look honestly at what is makes people strangers to themselves, unaware of their true feelings, failings, and needs. They become empty shells, reacting superficially to the people who occupy their lives. Codependents in denial also fail to believe or enjoy their own value and impact as persons of worth. Thinking themselves worthless, they refuse to genuinely offer the deep part of themselves to others. Absence of intimacy. A third consequence flows naturally out of the second. When we are strangers to ourselves, we cannot disclose ourselves to others, and the result is an absence of intimacy in even our closest relationships. A friend once asked me, "How long do you think my husband has been a stranger to me?" I replied, "He's been a stranger to himself, to his own motives, emotions, and needs, most of his life. How can he reveal himself to you when he doesn't know who he is himself?" It's impossible to share what we don't know. Until we reach in to enter our own pain and joy, we can't reach out to share someone else's pain or joy. If we can't be real about ourselves, we can't be real with anyone else. The basis for genuine intimacy is genuine honesty. Denial sabotages both. Perhaps most seriously, denial keeps people from being honest about who they have wounded others. Perhaps most seriously, Denial keeps people from being honest about how they have wounded others and rebelled against God. Denial about their own flaws, love failures, and anger prevents the very intimacy their souls long for from God and others, an intimacy that can come only through being deeply known and exposed and then forgiven and embraced. Denial prevents repentance and resists grace. Jesus and denial. Jesus, the perfect human being, never denied what was in his life. He always squarely faced his circumstances, even when they were terrible. When he began teaching his disciples about his approaching death, Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. "Never, Lord," he said. "This shall never happen to you." That's found in Matthew 16:22. Peter tried to force Jesus into denial of the awful truth by urging his own perception of reality. But Jesus resisted, choosing instead to look at reality without flinching and calling Peter's optimism satanic. Matthew 16:23. Nor did Jesus fall into denial about his pain. He never masked his true feelings but expressed them openly and without shame. He wept at Lazarus' grave, verbalized his frustration at the Pharisees' hypocrisy, expressed his anger by overturning the tables of the money changers and temple merchants, agonized to the point of sweating blood when facing his own death in Gethsemane, and finally gave up his life with a loud scream. His was the most consistently authentic life ever lived. Summing up, like all codependent characteristics, denial is rooted not just in fear, but also in rebellion against God. It reflects a misunderstanding of grace and a failure to live by that grace. God knows our hearts, and he knows codependency's strong hold on our lives. He desires us to face it squarely, not to shame us, but to free us from the prisons we've been living in for too long. He longs for us to abandon our non-authentic Christian lives built on pretense and self-protection and live instead in honesty and grace, which is impossible until we admit the bondage. We've examined in this first section 5 characteristics of codependency: self-forfeiture, self-contempt, self-aggrandizement, self-sufficiency, and self-deception. Different codependents emphasize different characteristics depending on their individual temperaments, upbringing, and life situations. But the common thread that runs through them all is self-preoccupation. Codependents are focused on themselves, on getting their own needs met in whatever way has worked for them in the past. Consider again the definition of codependency from Chapter 1. Codependency is a self-focused way of life in which a person blind to his, her true self continually reacts to others, being controlled by and seeking to control their behavior, attitudes, and or opinions, resulting in spiritual sterility, loss of authenticity, and absence of intimacy. Though the codependent's behaviors often look unselfish, at the core they're intended to keep the codependent in charge and out of personal pain. Codependency operates out of a determined demandingness that others affirm and please the codependent. Their demandingness can be a quiet or unruly, pleasant or ugly, passive or aggressive, sweet or abrasive way. But however it plays itself out, the internal dynamics of codependency are deeply self-centered. The next section will examine the development of codependency as a way of life that violates God's offer of genuine life in Christ, which makes it possible for us to love him above all and to love others as ourselves. Here are the questions for building community. Question number 1. Why is denial important to the members of abusive or addictive families? Question number 2. What are the negative consequences of denial in these areas? A. Spiritual, your relationship with God. B. Personal, your relationship with self. And C. Relational, your relationship with others. Number 3. What would it have cost David to have come out of denial about the abuse in his family from the beginning by dealing with Amnon's sin? Question number 4. How do frozen feelings keep codependents from being fully engaged in relationships? How does denial sabotage genuine Christian fellowship? Question number 5. Think of an instance when Jesus confronted people with the reality of A, their pain or disappointment, and B, their sin. Question number 6. How did Jesus' refusal to deny the reality of pain or sin lead to blessing for the people involved? Question number 7. Briefly describe one incident from your childhood that you would most like to ignore or forget. A. How would your life be different if you could forget it? B. How might denial be useful to you regarding that memory? And C. What might be the benefit of renouncing denial and facing the memory with honesty and integrity? The references from this chapter are as follows. Webster's New Collegiate Dictionary, Claudia Black, It Will Never Happen to Me, J.L. Greenleaf, Co-Alcoholic, Para-Alcoholic, Who's Who, Codependency, Timon L. Cermak, A Time to Heal, and the NIV Study Bible.